Good evening. I'm here to respond to the question of whether or not morality is in fact innate. I'd like to start out by sharing with you two scenarios, two hypotheticals, that hopefully bring this out into play a bit. The first is, imagine the situation. You're walking in the desert as part of a caravan, and one by one, people in the caravan are dying. The camels are dying. There's simply not enough food, and you're lost. You are the last person standing, and you're starving. And you have the option to either eat a camel or to eat one of the members of the caravan that is now deceased. Would you eat the camel or the person? The second scenario is a situation where you are lying in bed. You're not dressed, and all of a sudden you hear the fire alarm. You realize that there's a fire. You smell the smoke. And you have the option to either run out of the house in your birthday suit or to put on your wife's dress before you run out of the house. Which would you choose? In the Torah, there is a negative commandment, a prohibition on eating camels. There is no negative prohibition. There is no law against eating people. So should you eat the human or the camel? In the Torah, there is no prohibition on walking around in your birthday suit. But there is certainly a prohibition for a person to wear his wife's dress. So which would you do? I think many of us would say, at least for the question of the person starving in the desert, that they most certainly would rather eat the camel, regardless of what it says in the Torah. How could you eat a human being? How could you eat another member of the human race? And I think many people would also say, in relation to the house burning down, that some dispensations should be made. This person should be allowed to wear the dress until he gets out of the house to safety, rather than running outside and looking at the bucket brigade while not dressed. The reason we say this, the reason that we think this, is because there's something innate, something intuitive that we feel is real and compelling. And even though the Torah may not say that there is a negative command, a prohibition on eating human beings, but we have a feeling, an intuition that says that fundamentally we shouldn't be doing this. Better to eat the camel. And wouldn't you know that many rabbis in fact agree? And they say that you are correct. The innate intuition is something that in fact the Torah doesn't have to say. The Torah is predicated on the fact that you are going to use your innate intuition in order to be able to make the right decisions. The Torah, by definition, cannot encompass every possible permutation for every human being to walk the face of this planet, because we each have thousands upon thousands of possible ways to apply the Torah in our daily life. And each one of us has a very specific way that it applies to us. And that application is in no way applicable to anyone else in the world in that exact way. Or to put it another way, there is no mitzvah in the Torah that you should use your common sense. There's no mitzvah in the Torah that you should learn how to write, to read, to do arithmetic, to speak. But the Torah doesn't have to make explicit some things that are so fundamental and basic that all humans, by definition, would be doing that. There's an apocryphal story that supposedly took place with Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, who was the rabbi in Brisk, and formerly in the yeshiva in Volozhin. Whether it truly took place with him or someone else, it's hard to know. But supposedly there was a young, aspiring rabbinical student training for ordination who went to Rabbi Chaim Brisker to take his rabbinic exam and thereby obtain ordination. And as he sits down and is preparing himself for the questions that would be quite difficult, no doubt, that Rabbi Chaim Brisker would ask him, Rabbi Chaim Brisker asks him a question out of left field and says to the young man, "Please, enumerate to me the 5 books of the Jewish Code of Law." Now, everyone is familiar with the fact that the Jewish Code of Law, as codified by Rabbi Joseph Caro, only contains 4 sections, 4 books, not 5. And so this young man is flummoxed. He's confused. He says to Rabbi Soloveitchik, "I don't understand, sir. There's only 4 sections in the Code of Jewish Law, not 5. And Rabbi Soloveitchik responds to him and says, "You're wrong. There are actually 5 books. There are the 4 books that you're aware of and that you've studied. But there's a 5th book, what we would call the 5th Shulchan Aruch, the 5th chelik of the Shulchan Aruch. And that 5th chelik is common sense, without which, while you may know the other 4 sections perfectly well, you will have no idea how to apply it. You cannot apply the 4 sections without having the 5th down cold." The rabbis themselves developed this. In an amazing statement, Rabbi Yochanan, one of the greatest Amoraim, and the one who put together the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud, as opposed to the Babylonian Talmud, he says that Jerusalem, the second temple, was destroyed because they decided cases in the Jewish courts of law according to the Torah. And the mind is bothered by that one. The Jewish courts of law decided cases in accordance with Jewish law, and therefore Jerusalem was destroyed? How does that follow? Shouldn't Jewish courts of law be applying Jewish law, not Roman law? Jewish law, not canon law? And the answer is, of course. Jerusalem was destroyed because they applied and adjudicated cases based upon Jewish law without thinking, without considering the context and the complexities. They simply decided cases based upon the black letter law. And that will cause untold suffering, undue harm, and cause Jerusalem to be destroyed. What this story shows us is, as Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik said, we need a fifth Shulchan Aruch. We have to use our common sense. We have to remember that the law as written is not necessarily as it should be applied. There are many facets to the law. There are many laws that can be at play. And the interplay of the laws can be leading to various complexities. You can't just simply open a book and say, oh, well, on page X it says Y, so therefore we must do Z. Nachmanides, the great scholar in Spain before the Inquisition, says or coins the following term that has become popular today. In his commentary on the book of Leviticus, he suggests that the Torah has to have a catch-all command of be holy to your God. Kedoshim tihu, be holy unto your God. Because if not for that catch-all, it is quite possible for a person to be a naval b'reshut haTorah, for a person to be a disgusting person within the confines of the Torah. A naval is somebody disgusting, somebody gross. Abigail was Naval's wife. The prophets tell us that his name was Naval. Kishmo Kainhu, like his name, so he was. Naval just means disgusting, somebody repulsive, somebody beneath contempt. What Nachmanides is suggesting is that a person can take the 4 books, the 4 sections of the Code of Jewish Law, apply it to his daily life, and be in compliance with the black letter law. Technically, entirely correct, but spiritually obtuse, spiritually bereft, a person who is an absolute epitome of somebody disgusting. But you say, how's that possible? How's it possible to be in compliance with Jewish law? How's it possible to be acting in accordance with Jewish law and yet be a naval, and yet be somebody who's absolutely disgusting person? The answer is very simple. If you take the law at face value, if you take the law without applying common sense, if you take the law without understanding the context, you will end up in terrible situations. Well, how's one to know? How can you possibly ever formulate a Jewish law book, a section of this code, that will tell you, well, this is what you should be doing, this is how you should be applying the black letter law? And the answer is you can't. That 5th section of the Shulchan Aruch, that 5th section of the Jewish Code of Law, is not written. It is not to be found in any book. It cannot be bound by the confines of a book. It is intuitive. It is beyond what can be codified in words. It is a sense. It is something supernal. And everyone, every human being, has been blessed with it. And we know it's necessary. We know that you cannot study Torah and apply it to our lives without it. The Torah itself tells us that. And therefore created a catch-all to remind you to always be on guard. That even if you're technically following the rules and regulations, you might nevertheless still be heading into the abyss if you're not being true to the more supernal, intuitive, and innate side that connects one directly with God. I want to take it a step further. You see, you and I can each be acting in accordance with that spiritual supernal side in a given moment. And we can nevertheless be in conflict with each other. Think about a situation that you find yourself possibly in, where someone unfortunately is having a seizure or a heart attack. God forbid they are at death's door. And you live in one of those places where unfortunately they do not have the Herzog at the ready. And the response times of the first responders is very slow. And this person will be a dead man before you realize it. And it's really a matter of life and death. It's now or never. So you get into your car and you, with this person, you speed to the nearest hospital. A cop driving by, not knowing the context, sees you speeding at 100 miles an hour. And he attempts to pull you over to stop you. At that moment, each of you is acting in accordance with the law. Yes, it is true that by your speeding you're violating the technical law in relation to the speed limit, but there is another technical law about saving lives. And you're certainly in adherence to that. But this officer, he's in 100% adherence to trying to stop you in terms of ensuring public safety and attempting to make sure that the populace remain safe by trying to get you to pull over. So you see, you can have situations where two people, unbeknownst to one another, can be totally acting in harmony with the most intuitive and innate sense of what is correct, and at the same time still create a conflict with each other. It doesn't mean that there won't be conflicts, but it does mean that when that officer pulls you over and sees that person choking to death, dying, seizing up, that most likely that officer will now click in to some deeper truth that he needs to help save this person. And if he does not, if he simply writes you a citation while keeping that person from getting the needed help, you can understand the moral abhorrence, the condemnation that would resound upon such a police officer for doing such a heinous act. Because at that point in time, everyone would understand that there is a higher law of attempting to save a human life that should take precedence. So what we are saying thus far is that there is an innate, intuitive sense that we each have, and that innate and intuitive sense is something that exists without the Torah. It is something that the Torah itself needs in order to be able to be applied correctly. And it is something that exists in each and every one of us. And it does not mean that just because we're applying it, that there won't be conflicts. I'd like to take it a step further. You see, the rabbis have an incredible statement. They suggest that Abraham, the first of the patriarchs, the father of the Jewish people, they suggest that Abraham kept the entirety of the Torah. And on its face, that is an absurd claim. How could Abraham have kept the Torah that wasn't given until Moses? And the answer that the rabbis suggest is not that Abraham kept the Torah because he had on his bookshelves the 4 sections of the Code of Jewish Law. But no. That fifth section in Abraham was so developed. As the rabbis put it, it came through his kidneys. Or to put it another way, it was in his kishkas. In his very insides, Abraham understood what God wanted in a given situation and was able to act in accordance. You see, Abraham was a pre-Socratic Socratic. Abraham was someone, using Occam's razor, had reached the conclusion that God is not merely an idol. He's not merely one of the planets. He's not merely one of the stars. But rather, God is something beyond any human comprehension, beyond space, beyond time. Abraham understood that he could never positively apprehend God. And he spent his lifetime knocking down, through negative theology, all the claims about what God is. And as he kept up that arduous philosophical quest to find God, he kept on refining himself and refining himself until his very insides were so connected to the most deep, innate, spiritual truths that he was truly a supernal human being who was able to keep the entirety of the Torah without ever opening up a Jewish law book. Of course, we're not Abraham today, but the rabbis suggest that nevertheless, we would still be able to find many of these mitzvot just simply by looking at the natural world. We don't even have to practice the Socratic method. We could simply look at a cat and learn modesty, because a cat, when it takes care of its bowels, does it privately. Or faithfulness from various different animals that mate for life. Or courtship from the elaborate displays and mating rituals of various different animals. We could learn not to rob from the ant. We can learn cleanliness from animals. There's so much that we can learn from the natural world without having to open up the Torah, just simply by being aware of the world outside. Many of the mitzvot, say the rabbis, many of the mitzvot are simply common sense. Like, for example, not murdering your fellow, not worshiping idols, not cursing God, loving God. These are simple things in theory. In practice, maybe they are more complicated. But in theory, honoring your parents, respecting them, gratefulness, these are not complex commandments. They are commonsensical commandments. And many of the commandments in the Torah fall within these categories. And according to the rabbis, even if we were not Abraham, even if our very insides didn't proclaim the Lord in a way that we could hear at all times, we could nevertheless still, by looking out the world, be able to find the innate morality that exists within this planet, within this universe. So I ask you, then why do we need the Torah? If we all have a moral sense, maybe some of us it's less refined, some of us it's more, but we have that sense. And we need that sense in order to be able to interpret the Torah accurately and appropriately. Then why do we actually have to have the Torah? And the answer is, in part, as I alluded to before. But now I'd like to elaborate on it a bit. We all have an innate moral sense, but we also have a material sense. And in many of us, that material side is pretty strong. The life force of the spiritual, supernal side is sometimes quashed, is sometimes really innate, and doesn't really get to the outside, and is not able to sing its siren song. And so we don't hear it, and we don't respond to it. One of the things that the Torah does is that by formulating it in an objective way, externally, it forces adherence and reminds us that we need to ensure that that still small voice of morality that's innate and intuitive deep within inside us, in our innermost sanctum, needs to be cherished, needs to be watched and guarded, and needs to be allowed to flower, to bloom, and to become more powerful, and to really be the dominating force within us. But it's much easier said than done. It's a lifetime of work. Not just for Abraham, but for each and every one of us. So again, why do we need the Torah? We need the Torah because the Torah enables us to get to that space, to reach that place. It is the proving ground. I would like to spend a moment to talk about the lawgiver, the person who brought the Torah down to the Jewish people, Moses. We're all familiar with him as the greatest of human beings. But the Torah introduces Moses to us in a most astonishing way. It tells us that this was a person who lived in the lap of luxury. He grew up as a son in Pharaoh's home, in his palace. In that palatial atmosphere, Moses had every ability not to twin his fate with the Jewish people, but he does. The Torah details how he gives up his life as a pampered prince to go with the downtrodden, forlorn slaves that were his brothers. To what end, he had no idea. When he gave it all up, he had no idea that one day he would become the leader of the Jewish people. He let it all go away for naught, just because it was the right thing to do. Just because his innate spiritual sense was so dominant that it was not even a question. He just threw it all away. But it's more than that. God has to argue with Moses to become the leader of the Jewish people. In a most amazing passage, the Torah details God repeatedly adjuring Moses to please agree to become the leader of the Jewish people. Now, even if you're a modest person, if God is coming and He's giving you the vote of confidence, if He's suggesting to you, listen, this is a good idea. I want you to be the leader of the Jewish people. You would be hard-pressed to say no. Moses doesn't just say no once. He does so repeatedly. with fervor and with strength. He's fighting with God because he does not want to become the leader of the Jewish people. And it's the most mind-boggling. How could one argue with God? And the answer is that we learn about Moses later on in the book of Numbers. We learn that the Torah attests that Moses is the most humble of all men. Remember that humbleness in the parlance of the Torah doesn't mean somebody's unaware of who they are. Moses was well aware that he was the greatest of all human beings to ever live, that his prophetic ability surpassed everyone that existed before or subsequent to him. But Moses was also aware that with all that prophetic ability and with all of that closeness to God, that he wasn't even the most infinitesimal speck of dust in relation to God. Humbleness is awareness of the greater context. It's awareness of the fact that any being within space and time can never approximate, can never comprehend, can never apprehend even the most infinitesimal iota of God. And in that sense, there's nothing to be proud of. There is nothing to show off about. The fact that you're greater than a few other human beings, you're all a bunch of pieces of dust in relation to God. And so therefore for Moses, whose spiritual, supernal self is always on, is always dominating, for Moses, that is the prime person to give over the Torah. Because if we are to use the Torah as a way and as a means to get closer to God, to open up that spiritual, supernal, innate, intuitive side that hides in the shadows of each and every one of our souls, then we need a Torah that is entirely free of ambition, of ego, of materiality. We need a Torah that is given by the person most close to approximating the ideal of what a human being can be in a post-Edenic world. Moses is the most supernal person. He's the most in tune with his innate spiritual side. And therefore, he is the perfect person to give over the Torah, which is our roadmap to become that perfect person. And so, to conclude, the question of where does morality come from? Is it innate? The answer is, of course it's innate. Morality is in every one of us. Without the Torah, we would still have a moral sense. But we wouldn't necessarily be aware of it. It wouldn't necessarily be a dominant part of our personality. What the Torah does, what studying Torah does, what delving into Torah does, and what the Torah has done for thousands of years, is essentially create a system that enables those who study it to be able to become more contextualized, to be able to realize that there are aspects of their personality that need a little bit more subsuming and subservience and sublimation, and others that need to be put more to the forefront, more to the vanguard. Adhering to the Torah, studying the Torah, enables one to adhere and to apply the 4 sections correctly. It is a roadmap to enabling one to get really into tune with that 5th section of the Shulchan Aruch, that common sense, that innate supernal spiritual side that we all have. Have a great night.